To the family disappointment, my sister said, and her dead-end job. She lifted her glass while she said it. The whole table was watching. She let the words sit in the air like she'd rehearsed them in the car, and maybe she had. My father laughed first, and he laughed hardest, the big open laugh he saved for things he found genuinely funny, and my mother reached across the turkey and touched her glass to my sister's with a small, bright clink that I would think about for a long time afterward. I was 32 years old. I had built a career with my own two hands, and on Thanksgiving, in the house I grew up in, my family raised a toast to my failure and drank to it. I smiled. That's the part people never believe when I tell it. I smiled and I picked up my own glass and I said, "That's kind of you. Actually, I have news. My firm's restoration is being dedicated this summer. There's a gala, black tie. My boss insists I bring the whole family." I looked around the table at all of them. You'll finally get to see what a dead-end job looks like from the inside. My sister's smile flickered just slightly because she couldn't tell if I was being sincere or if I'd just done something to her she didn't understand yet. My father said, "Sure, sweetheart, we'll come laugh at the birdhouses," and everyone chuckled again, softer this time. My mother didn't laugh. My mother had gone very still, her glass halfway back to the table, and she was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. If I'd known then what I know now, I would have understood that she wasn't looking at me at all. She was looking at something behind me, something 8 months and 40 years away, something none of us could see yet. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If you're watching this, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button because stories like mine only find the people who need them when you do. Leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. And tell me one thing. Have you ever been the person your family decided was the failure? The one they measured everyone else against? Because I was, for 32 years. And I need you to understand how that happens slowly, one Thanksgiving at a time, before I can tell you how it ended. My name is Athena Townsend. I restore old buildings. I want to say that slowly because the way my family said it made it sound like something to be ashamed of, and it isn't. I am a historic preservation architect. When a 100-year-old building is falling down, when the roof has caved and the plaster is gone and the town has voted 3 times to demolish it, my firm is the one that walks in and figures out how to bring it back to life. We document what it was. We save what can be saved. We turn what everyone gave up on into something the whole community walks into again. My father called it playing with birdhouses. My sister called it a dead-end job. And for most of my adult life, I let them, because that's what you do when you're the disappointment. You get small, you take the joke. You learn to smile with your glass in your hand. Let me tell you about my family, because you have to understand the shape of them to understand what happened. My father, Curtis, ran a heating and cooling business for 30 years, and he believed a person's worth could be measured in the size of the check they brought home. He wasn't a cruel man exactly. He was a certain man. He had decided a long time ago what success looked like, and it looked like a truck and a boat and a daughter who made money loudly, and none of it looked like me. My sister Sloane was 3 years younger and had built a following online. She sold things. Skincare, then supplements, then a life design system, then whatever the algorithm was rewarding that quarter. She made real money at it. I'll give her that. And she made sure everyone knew, and in my family making money loudly was the highest form of virtue there was. Sloane was the proof my parents were right about the world. I was the counterexample they'd rather forget. And my mother, Lorna. My mother is the reason I'm telling this story at all. And she's the person in it I understand least, even now, even after everything. My mother was a careful woman. She kept a spotless house and a closed face. She had opinions about how things should look to other people, and she policed those opinions in her daughters without mercy. And of all the things my mother disapproved of, the thing she disapproved of most, the thing that could make her mouth go thin and her voice go cold, was my work. Not Sloane's endless selling. Not the schemes, not the filtered photos, not the debt I suspected was hiding behind all that shine. My mother saved her real contempt for me and my old buildings. For years, I thought she just found what I did embarrassing, unglamorous, poor. I was wrong. It took me until I was 32 to understand that my mother wasn't ashamed of my work. My mother was afraid of it. She'd spent my whole life afraid of it, and I never knew, because you can't see the shape of a fear when you're standing inside it. Here's the first thing I want you to hold on to because it matters later. When I was 9 years old, I found a photograph. I was in my mother's closet where I wasn't supposed to be looking for wrapping paper, and there was a shoebox on the high shelf behind the winter sweaters. Inside it were the kinds of things mothers keep: a hospital bracelet, a dried flower, a church program, and there was a photograph, an old one, with the white border they used to have, and it had been torn in half. My mother was in it. She was young, maybe 17, laughing in a way I had never once seen her laugh, standing in front of a stone wall. Her arm was around someone. You could see her hand resting on a shoulder that wasn't there anymore, because the other half of the photograph, the person she was laughing with, had been torn away and was gone. I put it back. I never told anyone. I was 9, and I didn't have the words for why a torn photograph in a shoebox felt like a locked door. But I remembered the wall, rough gray stone, laid by hand, the kind of wall I would spend my whole adult life learning to read. I remembered her laugh, and I remembered that my mother had kept the half with herself in it and destroyed the half with him. Hold on to that, I didn't understand it for 23 years. Now, the dead-end job. I worked for a preservation studio, a good one of the best in the region. And about a year before that Thanksgiving, we had won a commission that changed everything for me. There was a building 3 hours north of us in a small Pennsylvania town called Delford, and it had been sitting empty and condemned for 4 decades. It was called the Halloran Home. In its day, it had been a county institution. Part children's home, part place where young, unmarried women went when they were pregnant and the world wanted them out of sight. It had closed in the 80s. The town had tried to tear it down twice, and then a man with money and a reason had stepped in and bought it and decided it was going to live again as a community arts center, and he had hired my firm, and my boss had, to everyone's surprise, put me in charge of the historic side of it. The man with the money was our firm's founding principal, my boss. His name was Julian Cole, and he was maybe 40 years old, and he had built one of the most respected preservation practices in the country out of nothing. Nobody knew much about where he came from. He didn't talk about it. He was quiet and exact and fair in a way that unsettled people who were used to being judged by their last names, because Julian Cole did not care about your last name. He cared whether you were good. He had looked at my work, not my father, not my last name, not my sister's follower count, my work, and he had decided I was good, and he had handed me the most important project of my life. I never told my family the Halloran home was in Delford. It didn't come up. Why would it? My mother had grown up, she always said, in a town 2 counties over, a place she never took us to visit and never talked about, and I had no reason on earth to connect the two. Delford was just a dot on a map where a beautiful broken building was waiting for me. I want to be honest with you about something, because this story only works if I am. When I invited my family to that gala on Thanksgiving, I wasn't setting a trap. I know it reads like a trap. I know the whole thing sounds like I'd planned it, like I knew, like I was the puppet master. I didn't know anything. I was a woman who'd been laughed at over turkey, and I reached for the one thing I had that was mine and good and undeniable, and I held it up, and I said, "Come and see." That was all. I wanted them to see the building. I wanted them to stand in a room I had saved and feel, just for one evening, that they had been wrong about me. I had no idea what I was inviting into that room. I had no idea that the truth about my mother, the truth about the torn photograph, the truth about why she had spent 30 years afraid of the work I loved, was sitting in a filing cabinet in a state archive with her maiden name on it, waiting for me to do my job well enough to find it. Because that's the thing nobody in my family understood about a dead-end job. My job is to open the walls of old buildings and read what's written there. My job is to find the truth a place has been hiding. And I was about to point that skill, without knowing it, straight at my own mother. The dedication gala was set for the following July, 8 months away. Between that Thanksgiving and that Friday night in July, I would learn who my mother was. I would learn who my boss was, and I would learn who I was, which turned out to be the hardest one of all. So let me take you back to Delford, to the winter after that Thanksgiving, to the cold week I first walked into the Halloran home with a flashlight and a clipboard, and no idea that I was walking into my own family's grave. The building was worse than the photographs. They always are. The east wing had a partial roof collapse, and there was ice on the third-floor stairs where water had been getting in for 40 years. But underneath the ruin, it was magnificent. 1911, hand-laid brick, the kind of craftsmanship you cannot buy anymore because the men who knew how to do it are gone. I stood in the front hall with my breath fogging in the cold, and I felt the thing I always feel, the thing my family never understood, the thing that makes this the opposite of a dead end. I felt the building wanting to be saved, and I said out loud to the empty, ruined hall, "Okay, let's bring you back." I didn't know it was going to bring my mother back, too. Let me explain what my job actually involves, because it's the engine of everything that happened. And if you think preservation is just picking paint colors, you'll miss how the truth came out. To restore a building like the Halloran home and pay for it, you use something called the Federal Historic Tax Credit. It's real. It's how half the old buildings you love are still standing. And to qualify, you have to prove the building matters. You have to write its history. You have to document what preservationists call the period of significance. What the building was, who used it, why it should be saved. For a former county home, that meant I couldn't just measure bricks. I had to find the people. I had to reconstruct from whatever records survived the human life of the place, the children who were housed there, the young women who were sent there, the staff, the story. And that is how a woman who restores buildings ends up in a reading room at the State Archives, 3 hours from home, wearing white cotton gloves, opening boxes that had not been opened in 40 years. When the Halloran home closed in the 80s, its administrative records didn't get thrown away. Institutional records almost never do. They got boxed and deposited at the State Archive, the way these things are, and they sat there. Some of it was sealed. The actual adoption files, the medical files, those are restricted for decades by law, and I couldn't have touched them and wouldn't have tried. But the administrative ledgers, the intake registers, the daily logs, the employment records, those a preservationist doing legitimate historical documentation can request. I filed the paperwork. I explained the project, and 8 weeks after that Thanksgiving, on a gray Thursday in January, an archivist wheeled a card up to my table with 9 gray boxes on it and said, "Nobody's ever asked for these. Good luck." I want you to hold on to that image because it's the truest picture of my so-called dead-end job I can give you. A woman at a table, white gloves, 9 boxes nobody had ever asked for. And somewhere in those boxes, though I didn't know it yet, my mother's name. But first, let me tell you what was happening back home. Because while I was in that reading room, my sister was building something too. Sloan found out about the project the way Sloan found out about everything, which is that she asked our mother, and our mother told her. And Sloan did not like it. You have to understand that in our family, there was only room for one daughter who mattered. And Sloan had held that seat her whole life, and it had never once been threatened because I made birdhouses. But now the disappointment had a black tie gala and a famous boss, and Sloan felt the floor move under her, and she did what people like Sloan do when the floor moves. She got out ahead of it. She decided the story. The story she decided was this, that I hadn't earned anything. That a woman doesn't get handed the biggest project at a prestigious firm by a rich, powerful single man unless something is going on. She never said it to my face. She said it the way it does the most damage, sideways to everyone else with a little laugh, with concern in her voice. "I just worry about her," she told our mother. "You know how she is, getting in over her head with a man like that. I hope she knows what she's doing." And our mother, who should have defended me, said nothing. And our father, who heard it secondhand, decided it explained everything. Because in my father's world, a woman didn't earn a thing like that. She was given it. And there was only one reason a man gives a woman a thing. I found out about it in the group chat. Not directly, nobody says it directly, but my father sent a message asking, with a heaviness I could feel through the screen, whether Julian Cole was married or what, and whether I was being smart about this. And Sloan sent back a single line. "I'm sure Athena knows exactly what she's doing," with an emoji that turned all of it into a joke I was the punchline of. I sat in a motel room in Delford and read it 4 times. I had spent 2 years and every ounce of skill I had earning that project, and my family had decided, without a shred of proof, that I'd earned it on my back. I didn't defend myself. That's the part I'm not proud of. I put the phone face down. I told myself the work would speak for itself. But something hardened in me that night, and I think you know the feeling. The specific cold that comes when the people who are supposed to be on your side decide the worst thing about you and call it concern. The next morning, I went back to the boxes. Now, about Julian. I need to be careful here because I know where your mind goes. The same place my family's went, and I need you to go somewhere else with me. There was nothing between us. There was never going to be. But there was something I noticed that winter that I didn't understand, and it's the second thread you need to hold. Julian Cole had chosen this building. Out of every crumbling landmark in the country, he had put his own money into a condemned county children's home in a town nobody had heard of. And when I asked him, once, over bad coffee in the site trailer, why this one, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something I've never forgotten. He said, "Because no one ever came back for it." And then he changed the subject. Over that winter, I learned things about him, in pieces, the way you learn about a private person. He had grown up in the system, foster homes, group placements, in this county, this exact county. He had aged out at 18 with a garbage bag of clothes and no one, and he had built everything he had, brick by brick, alone. And that spring, he told me one more thing, almost by accident, standing in the ruined nursery on the second floor where the old iron cribs were still bolted to the floor. He said Pennsylvania had changed its law back in the late 20-teens. Adult adoptees could finally request their original birth certificate. The real one. The one with the birth mother's name on it, sealed away since the day they were born. He said he'd finally sent for his. He said it had come in the mail a month ago and he still hadn't opened the part that mattered. I remember thinking how brave that was, and how sad, and I remember thinking it had nothing to do with me. A man looking for where he came from. I filed it away as something private about my boss. I did not connect it to 9 gray boxes and a torn photograph and a stone wall. Why would I? You don't see the shape of a thing when you're standing inside it. I keep telling you that because it's the truest thing I know. Back to the boxes. Reading intake registers from a place like the Halloran home is not like reading a spreadsheet. These were human beings, column after column, in fading fountain pen ink, the young women who'd been sent there. A name, an age, a date of admission, a home county, and a final column. The staff filled in when they left, sometimes just a date, sometimes a single word. 16 years old, 17, 18. Sent by families who didn't want the shame in an era that treated a pregnant unmarried girl like a stain to be hidden and scrubbed. I read 100 of those names that winter, and every one of them was somebody's whole life, folded down into a line in a ledger and forgotten. And I found the tradesman, too, in a separate employment log because a building like that needed constant upkeep, and the county hired local men to do it. Carpenters, a plumber, and a stonemason, listed year after year, through the mid-'80s, a young man hired to repair the garden walls and the front steps and the low stone wall along the property line. I noticed him because I noticed stonework. I noticed him because good hand-laid stone is rare, and whoever this mason was, his walls were still standing when the roof had caved. I photographed his page. I told myself it was for the tax credit narrative. Local craftsman, period of significance, the human hand in the building. That's what I told myself. His name is not the point yet. The wall is the point. Because 2 weeks later, cataloging the exterior, I stood at the back of the property in front of a low stone wall the mason had built 40 years ago. Gray stone laid by hand, and something moved in me that I couldn't name. Some old, cold feeling from a shoebox on a high shelf. I stood there a long time. I told myself I was tired. I took my photographs and I went back to the motel, and I did not sleep well, and I did not know why. And if you had told me that I was standing in front of the exact wall in the torn photograph, the wall my 17-year-old mother had laughed against with her arm around a boy whose face she would later tear away and destroy, I would have told you that you'd lost your mind. I want to pause here, because this is where people always ask me the same question. They ask why I didn't figure it out sooner, and the answer is the whole point of this story. I didn't figure it out because my mother had spent 40 years making sure no one could. She had changed the town she said she was from. She had used her married name my whole life. She had torn the man out of the photograph and kept only the safe half. She had built a spotless, closed, careful life on top of a grave, and she had raised 2 daughters on that ground, and she had spent every one of my birthdays afraid that the daughter who dug into old buildings for a living would one day dig in the wrong place. She just never imagined the wrong place would come looking for me. I want to tell you about the week the whole project almost died, because my family never understood that a dead-end job has stakes, real ones, the kind that keep you up at night, and this is the week that proves it. In February, the county tried to kill the restoration. There had always been a faction in Delford that wanted the Halloran home gone. Bad memories, some of them, and a developer who wanted the land, and a county commissioner who'd promised him the parcel. When our tax credit application cleared the state, that faction realized the building was actually going to be saved, and they moved fast. The commissioner called an emergency vote to condemn the structure as a safety hazard and demolish it before the credits could be locked in. He had an engineer's letter saying the east wing was unsound. He had 3 votes lined up. If it passed, the building came down in 90 days, credits or no credits. And 2 years of my life came down with it, and Julian lost the one place on earth he'd bought for a reason he couldn't say out loud. Julian was traveling that week, closing on another project. It landed on me. Just me. The disappointment with the dead-end job, standing between a bulldozer and the last standing wall of a place I didn't yet know, held my own mother's secret. And I want you to hear how I fought it, because it's the same thing I'd do at the gala 5 months later. I didn't fight it with feelings. I fought it with the record. I stayed up 3 nights straight, and I did what I'm actually good at. I pulled the commissioner's engineer's letter, and I read it the way I read everything closely, and I found that it described the wrong wing. A copy-paste error from another job, a boilerplate condemnation with the address changed and the structural details left in. I got our own structural engineer to document, with drawings and load calculations, that the east wing was stabilized and safe. I pulled the deed history and the state's own listing and proved the demolition would trigger a clawback of public grant money the county had already spent, which meant tearing it down would cost them more than saving it. And then I did the thing my family would have found beneath them. I drove to Delford and I stood up at that public meeting, in a room full of people who wanted the building gone, and I laid it all out. The falsified letter, the real engineering, the money, calmly, in order, until there was nothing left to argue with. The vote failed, 4-1. The commissioner didn't look at me. The developer left before it was over, and an old woman came up to me afterward, someone who'd grown up in that town, and put her hand on my arm and said, "My sister was sent to that home. Thank you for not letting them erase it." I didn't understand then how close that sentence was to my own life. I just drove back to the motel and shook for an hour, the way you do when you've held something up alone and it didn't fall. I never told my family about that week. What would I have said? They thought I arranged flowers in old houses. They didn't know I'd stood alone in front of a county government and saved a landmark with 3 nights of documents and my own steady voice. They didn't know a dead-end job could have a night like that in it. But I knew. And something in me had started to stand up straighter, months before the gala, in a cold meeting room in a town I didn't yet know was my mother's. I finished the archival work in March. I wrote the history. It was good. It was the best documentation I'd ever produced, and the tax credit application sailed through the state review, and the project was fully funded, and my name was on it as the historian of record. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt haunted, and I didn't know by what. And then, in April, 2 things happened in the same week, and after that week, nothing in my life was ever the same. The first thing was small. My mother called me. My mother never called me. She called Sloan. I called her dutifully on schedule. But that April, my mother called me out of nowhere and asked, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound casual, about the project. Where exactly was it? What was the building? What was it called? And when I said the words, "The Halloran Home," up in Delford, there was a silence on the line so complete and so long that I said, "Mom, are you there?" And she said too quickly, "Yes, fine. It just sounds like a lot of work, that's all." And she got off the phone within the minute. I sat there holding my phone. Something was wrong. I didn't know what, but I knew my mother, and I knew the difference between her boredom and her fear, and that had been fear. The second thing that happened that week was that I found the box that wasn't supposed to be there. I'd gone back to the archive one last time to close out a loose end in my documentation, and the archivist brought me a box I hadn't requested. A supplemental box of loose registers that had been separated from the main collection, misfiled decades ago, only just reunited. She apologized for missing it. She said, "There's another intake ledger in here, if it helps." It helped. It helped in a way that took the floor out from under my life. It was the admission register for the year 1985, and I read it the way I'd read all the others, name by name, a woman doing her job, and about 2/3 of the way down a page I came to a line in faded blue ink, and my own name looked back at me. Not my first name, my last name, my mother's last name, the one from before she married my father. The name I'd seen on exactly one document my whole life, a yellowed baptism certificate she kept in the good drawer. Ashby. Lorna Ashby, age 17, home county, the county Delford sits in, admitted March 1985. I sat very still. I want to tell you I stayed professional. I didn't. My hands were shaking so badly I had to put them flat on the table, because I knew my mother's maiden name, and I knew her age, and I knew, suddenly and completely, that the town she'd always claimed she was from was a lie, that she'd never grown up 2 counties over, that she had grown up right here, in Delford, in the shadow of this building, and that at 17 years old, she had been admitted to the Halloran Home. You know what the Halloran Home was. I've told you. It was where young women went when they were pregnant and unmarried, and the world wanted them hidden. My mother had a child before she married my father. I need you to sit with how that felt, because everything I thought I knew about my family rearranged itself in about 90 seconds at that table. The closed face, the spotless house, the terror of appearances, the thing she disapproved of most in the whole world being the daughter who dug up the past for a living. It wasn't snobbery. It had never been snobbery. My mother had buried a child and a life in this town and had spent 40 years praying no one would ever come back for it. And her own daughter had grown up, become an expert at coming back for exactly the things people bury, and gotten hired to restore the building she'd buried it in. If you believe in fate, this is where you'd feel it. I don't, particularly. I believe in records. I believe the past leaves marks and someone eventually learns to read them. But I sat in that reading room and I understood for the first time that when my mother touched her glass to my sisters on Thanksgiving and drank to my dead-end job, she wasn't mocking me. She was warning me. She just couldn't say from what. Before I go on, I need you to do something for me. This is the part of the story where I still didn't know the worst of it, where I had one piece and not the whole shape. So before I tell you what the document said next, tell me in the comments, what did you think my mother was hiding? And what do you think it cost her to keep it? Because I promise you, whatever you're guessing, the truth was both smaller and larger than that. And it changed the way I understand the word disappointment for the rest of my life. Write down your guess now, then come back to me. I didn't confront her. I want you to understand the discipline that took, because everything in me wanted to drive 3 hours home and put that ledger on her kitchen table and watch her face. But I am a preservationist. My whole training, my whole self, is built on one principle. You do not tear into a wall on a hunch. You document first. You prove it. You find the truth objectively so that no one can ever tell you that you imagined it, so that it stands on its own without your feelings holding it up. A maiden name and a date are not proof of who a woman is. So I did my job. I went looking for the rest. And this is where it stopped being about my mother's past and started being about mine. I went back to the employment log to the stonemason, the young man who'd built the walls that outlasted the roof. I'd photographed his page months earlier for reasons I couldn't explain. Now I read it with new eyes. He'd worked at the Halloran home from 1983 through the mid-'80s. He was local. He was young. And when I laid his employment page next to my mother's admission page, the years overlapped exactly. A 17-year-old girl hidden away at the county home in the spring of 1985, a young stonemason working that same property, laying stone by hand in the same seasons, and a low gray wall at the back of the property, a wall a girl might lean against, laughing with her arm around a boy, a wall someone might photograph, a photograph someone might, years later, tear in half, keeping herself, destroying him. I drove out to the wall that evening and stood in front of it in the long April light, and I finally let myself see it. The stone in my mother's shoebox photograph, the stone I'd been photographing all winter without breathing right, the same wall. My mother, at 17, had loved the boy who built this wall, and I had spent my entire adult life laying my hands on stone exactly like it, learning to read the work of men exactly like him, coming home covered in the same dust, lit up by the same thing. And my mother had looked at me across the dinner table every single time and seen a ghost. That was the moment the whole shape of my childhood turned inside out, right there, at that wall. I had always believed I was the disappointment because I'd failed to become what my family valued. I thought I was the cautionary tale, the one who chose a small, poor life over money and shine, and that my mother's coldness was her grief over the daughter I refused to be. That's what I'd carried for 32 years. It was exactly backwards. My mother wasn't cold to me because I'd failed. My mother was cold to me because I'd succeeded at being him, at being the exact thing she'd loved and lost and buried and spent her whole life running from. Every blueprint on my kitchen table was his trade. Every time I talked about hand-laid stone and old craft and saving what the world wanted to demolish, I was speaking in the dead man's language. I wasn't her disappointing daughter. I was her 17th spring, walking back into the house, wearing her firstborn's father's soul, again and again at every holiday for 32 years. And she couldn't look at it. She couldn't bear it. So she called it a dead-end job, and she taught my father and my sister to laugh at it. And she made the whole family help her push away the thing she was most afraid to feel. Because if she could make it small, make it a joke, make it nothing, then maybe it wasn't the ghost of the only man she ever loved sitting at her table drinking her coffee, asking her to pass the rolls. The word disappointment was never about me at all. It was the name my mother gave her own fear so she'd never have to say its real name out loud. I have thought about this more than I have thought about almost anything in my life. How a parent can take a private wound and hand it to a child to carry, wrapped up as a flaw in the child. How you can spend 3 decades believing you are less than, when the truth is you were simply unbearable to look at, because you reminded someone of what they'd killed in themselves to survive. I'm not saying it to excuse her. I'll get to what I think she owed me. I'm saying it because when I understood it, standing at that wall, I stopped being angry at myself. For the first time in my life, the smallness lifted, and I saw that it had never been mine. It was hers. She'd just been storing it in me. And that changed what I did next, because a woman who thinks she's a disappointment stays quiet and grateful, but a woman who understands she's been carrying someone else's fear her whole life, that woman goes and finds out the whole truth, not to burn anyone down, to finally put the weight down where it belonged. So I asked the one question I'd been circling. If my mother had a baby at the Halloran home in 1985, what happened to that baby? I already knew I couldn't answer it from the sealed records. Those were locked by law and would stay locked. But I didn't need the sealed records. I had something better. I had a boss who'd been born in this county, aged out of this county's foster system, and had just that very spring sent away for the original birth certificate the state had kept from him his whole life. A man who'd bought this exact building because, he said, no one ever came back for it. I had spent months telling myself Julian Cole's search had nothing to do with me. I stood at that wall in the dark, and I finally let myself do the math. Here's the math I did at the wall. Julian Cole was born in 1986. My mother was admitted to the Halloran home in the spring of 1985 at 17, and a young woman admitted in the spring might well deliver late that year or early the next. Julian had grown up in the county foster system, which is exactly where a baby relinquished at the Halloran home would have entered the world. He had bought this building because no one ever came back for it. And he had, that very spring, sent for the original birth certificate that would name, for the first time in his life, the woman who gave birth to him. I stood there, and I felt the whole thing lock into place. And then I made myself stop. Because a feeling is not proof. A timeline that fits is not proof. I had been trained my entire career to distrust the story I wanted the evidence to tell, and I made myself distrust this one. Because if I was right, then the man I worked for was my brother, and the woman who raised me had abandoned him, and I would not say a thing like that to another human being on the strength of a hunch and a torn photograph. I needed it to be true or not true on the documents alone. That is who I am. That is the dead-end job. And it turned out to be the only thing that could carry a truth this heavy without breaking. But there was a wall I couldn't cross by myself, and it wasn't made of stone. The adoption records were sealed. The only document on earth that could name Julian's birth mother was Julian's own original birth certificate. The one sitting in his desk drawer, still unopened at the part that mattered because he'd been too afraid to read it. I could not open that. I would not steal it or trick it out of him or manipulate a grieving man into handing me his own beginning. Whatever I did next, it had to leave the choice in his hands. It was his birth. It was his mother. It was his to decide. So I sat with it for the better part of 2 months, and they were the worst weeks of my life. And I want to tell you honestly how heavy an unshared truth is. I went to work every day and stood next to a man I now believed was my brother, and I said nothing. I watched him kneel in the dust of a building his own mother had been hidden in, restoring it with a care I finally understood, and I said nothing. Twice I opened my mouth. Twice I closed it, because I kept thinking about the cost of being wrong and the cost of being right, and I couldn't tell you which one scared me more. Meanwhile, at home, my family was getting ready for a party. The formal invitations had gone out. The firm's gala, the dedication of the Halloran home, the 3rd Friday in July. My name was printed on the program as the project's preservation architect and historian, and my family responded exactly the way you'd expect. My father asked if there'd be an open bar. My sister asked if it was a real event or one of your little history things. And then, when she saw photographs of the restored ballroom online, she decided to come after all. And she decided why she was coming, and she told everyone. Sloan announced to the family and to a not small number of people online that she was attending her sister's big night to support her, and privately to our parents that she was going to finally see what's really going on with this boss. She had built the story of me and Julian into a whole narrative by then. In her telling, I was a woman who'd slept her way onto a project she couldn't have earned, and the gala was going to be the reveal, the moment everyone saw the rich older man with his hand on the small of my back and understood. She was so certain. She was so publicly, confidently certain. Keep that in mind, because certainty like that has a way of becoming the rope you hang yourself with. My father believed her because it fit what he already believed about women and money. He told my mother in front of me on a Sunday visit that he hoped I wasn't going to embarrass the family, and my mother, and this is the part I noticed, my mother didn't join in. My mother had gone quiet and gray around the edges every time the gala came up. And that Sunday, when my father said the name out loud, this Julian Cole, and mentioned he was some big deal from up north, 40 or so, my mother set down the dish she was drying very carefully with 2 hands, the way you set something down when your hands can't be trusted, and left the room. I watched her go, and I understood that my mother had done her own math. She didn't have the register. She didn't have the employment log or the wall or the years laid side by side. But she had something I didn't. She had the memory of a face. And somewhere in the last few weeks she had heard enough. The town, the age, the man buying the Halloran home of all the buildings in the world. And a cold hand had closed around her heart, and she had begun to be afraid in a way that had nothing to do with appearances. My mother was starting to suspect that the son she'd given away had grown up and gotten rich and bought the building where she'd lost him and hired her daughter and was about to be standing in a ballroom while she walked in wearing her good earrings. She could have told me then. She could have stopped it. She chose, instead, to try to talk me out of bringing the family to the gala at all. Suddenly it was too far to drive. Suddenly her back was bad. Suddenly Sloane's night would be better spent elsewhere. I told her it was already arranged. I told her my boss insisted. I didn't understand yet that I was walking my mother toward the one door in the world she'd spent 40 years bricking shut. I couldn't wait any longer. 10 days before the gala, I asked Julian to stay after a site meeting, and I told him the truth. Not a hunch. The evidence. I laid it out the way I'd lay out a case for saving a condemned building. Calmly, in order, on documents. I showed him the admission register, Lorna Ashby, 17, spring 1985. I showed him the employment log and the Masons' overlapping years. I told him the town my mother lied about being from was this town. And then I told him the last part, the part that made my voice shake, which was that Lorna Ashby was my mother's maiden name, and that I had reason to believe the baby she relinquished here in early 1986 was him. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next, because it's the most private thing I've ever witnessed, and it belongs to him more than me. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he went to his bag and took out an envelope, worn soft from being handled, and he said he'd carried it for 2 months and never read past the first line. It was his original birth certificate. He opened it at the table, and he read the box he'd been afraid of, the one that names the mother, and I watched a 40-year-old man learn his mother's name at the same instant it confirmed everything I'd found. The name on the line was Lorna Ashby. He set it on the table next to my register, and the 2 documents sat there in the trailer light, one from 1986, one from 1985, saying the same name, and neither of us said anything for a while, because there was nothing left to prove. The building had told the truth. the way old buildings do if you know how to read them. My boss was my brother. My mother had given him away and spent 40 years making sure no one would ever find the door. And her own daughter had been hired to restore the door and had learned to read it and had found him. Julian is a quiet man, and he stayed quiet, but I saw what it cost him, and I saw something else too. I saw him decide right there that he was not going to be a weapon. He looked at me and he said, "This is hers to answer for, not yours, and I'm not going to ambush a woman in a ballroom." He said he would meet her. He wanted to meet her. He'd wanted it his whole life, but on his terms, as himself, not as a grenade rolled across a party for anyone's revenge. That's the kind of man he'd built himself into, alone, with no one. I have never respected anyone more. So we made a plan, the two of us, my brother and I. It was a simple plan. He would host his gala as he'd always intended, and he would greet my family as my boss, warmly, the way he greeted everyone, and he would give my mother the one thing she'd never given him, a choice. If she wanted to walk up to her son and finally say his name, the door would be open. If she wanted to keep it shut, he would let her and grieve and go home. He would not force it. What neither of us planned for, what I couldn't have planned for, because I still underestimated her, was my sister. Because Sloane was coming to that gala with a story she'd already sold to everyone we knew, a story about a fraud and a rich man's mistress, and she was coming to prove it in public. And a person who has publicly staked everything on a lie will do almost anything when the truth walks into the room rather than admit what they've done. I didn't know that yet. 10 days out, I only knew that I finally had a brother and that my mother was going to walk into a ballroom on the third Friday in July and see, standing under the chandelier of the building where she'd left him 40 years on, the grown face of the boy she'd torn out of a photograph. I knew she was going to go white before he said a word. What I didn't know was what the rest of us would do after she did. There was one more thing I found before the gala, and I almost didn't go looking because I already had my proof, and some part of me knew this last piece would only hurt. But I'm a preservationist. We finish the record. We don't leave a wall half read. I went back for the mason, the young man from the employment log, the one who built the wall my mother leaned against, the one she'd torn out of the photograph. I wanted to know what happened to him, because a piece of me had started to hope, foolishly, that this story had a living man in it somewhere, a father Julian could still meet, a door that hadn't been bricked shut forever. So I pulled the local newspaper archives, which are public, which anyone can read, and I found him. He died in 1987. He was 22. A scaffolding collapse on a job 2 towns over, the kind of thing that made 3 inches of newsprint and then nothing. A year and a half after my mother left this building without her baby, the boy who built these walls was gone too. She'd have been 19. She'd have heard, in whatever town she'd fled to, that the boy she loved was dead. And she was already carrying the secret of the child she'd given away. And now the only other person on earth who'd shared that spring was in the ground. And she was alone with all of it. And she was 19 years old. I sat in the library with that clipping for a long time, because it explained the last thing I hadn't understood. It explained why she tore him out of the photograph instead of just putting it away. You don't destroy a face you can still be angry at. You destroy a face you can't survive looking at. My mother didn't hate that boy. My mother loved him and lost his child in the same year. And then she built a whole careful life on top of the crater and swore never to feel the edges of it again. And then, decades later, she had a daughter who fell in love with stone and old craft and saving broken buildings, who came to the table smelling of mortar dust, lit up by the exact fire that had lit him. And my mother had to look at the ghost of everything she'd buried, every single day, in her own child's face, and she could not bear it. So she taught the whole family to call it a dead-end job and laugh. I'm not telling you this to make you forgive her. I've told you that. I'm telling you because when I understood it, I stopped needing her to be a villain, and that turned out to matter for what I did at the gala. I wasn't walking in there to destroy my mother. I was walking in there to stop carrying her. Meanwhile, my sister made sure I couldn't keep any of this quiet even if I'd wanted to. 10 days out, Sloan took the story public. Not our family's private group chat, public. She posted a long, weepy, beautifully lit video to her followers about watching someone you love get in over their head, about women who take shortcuts, about how success you didn't earn always comes out eventually. She never said my name. She didn't have to. Everyone we knew understood exactly who the sister with the older boss and the sudden fancy project was. And the comments filled up with people I'd known my whole life, clucking their tongues at a version of me that didn't exist. It reached a few thousand people. A few of them were in our industry. For the first time, the lie my family told about me wasn't just a private ache. It was out in the world with my professional reputation attached to it. And it was spreading, and I couldn't answer it without proof because a denial is just noise. Only the truth is loud enough, and the truth wasn't mine to spend yet. That was the moment the stakes changed for me. Up until then, the gala had been about pride, about showing them the building, about being seen once. Now it was about survival. My sister had turned my life's work into evidence of a crime I hadn't committed, in public, and the only thing on earth that could clear my name was the very truth my mother had spent 40 years burying and my brother had trusted me to handle with care. I was going to have to choose, in front of everyone, between protecting my mother's secret and defending my own name. I already knew which one I'd choose. I want to be honest about that. But I hated that Sloan had built the trap, and I hated that she'd built it so well. I drove home once before the gala. I don't fully know why. I told myself it was to confirm the RSVP. I sat in my mother's kitchen, the spotless kitchen, and I watched her make coffee with her back to me, and I came so close to saying it. I had the register in my bag. I had the newspaper clipping. I could have set it all on the table and ended 40 years of running right there in the good light of her kitchen. I didn't. And here's why. Because it's the heart of who I decided to be. It wasn't my secret to spend in that kitchen. It was Julian's. The truth of that lost baby belonged first to the man who'd been the baby, and he had asked for one thing, not to be a weapon, not to be a grenade, to meet his mother as himself on his terms. If I'd unloaded it on my mother in her kitchen to feel powerful for an afternoon, I'd have stolen my brother's one choice the same way my mother stole his childhood. I wouldn't do to him what had been done to him. So I drank my coffee and I watched my mother's careful hands, and I said, "You should come Friday, Mom. It matters to me." And she looked at me with that gray, frightened face, and she said, "I know it does," in a voice that told me she already knew everything that was coming and had decided to walk into it anyway, because some part of her had been waiting 40 years for someone to finally come back for what she left in that building. Neither of us said another word about it. We just sat there, a mother and a daughter, on the last quiet afternoon before the truth, both of us carrying the same weight from opposite ends, both of us finally, almost, ready to put it down. The third Friday in July came in warm and gold. I got to the Halloran home 3 hours before anyone, the way I always do before a dedication, and I walked the building alone one last time. I want you to see it, because this is the part my family had spent my whole life refusing to see. The ballroom I'd found under 40 years of ruin was whole again. The plaster ceiling medallion, which had been on the floor in 300 pieces when I started, was back where it belonged, restored by hand. The windows I'd fought the county to save were full of the last of the daylight. The stair I'd nearly fallen through in January swept up in one clean curve. 200 people from the town were going to walk in here tonight and stand in a place that had been condemned, a place everyone had given up on, and they were going to see it live again. I had done that. Not a man, not a boss's favor. Me and my hands. and the skill my family called a dead end. I stood in the middle of that ballroom, and for the first time in a very long time, I was not small. Julian found me in the ballroom an hour before the doors opened. He was in his tuxedo, and he looked like what he was, a man who'd built himself into someone the world respected. And he stood next to me in the middle of the room our mother had lost him in, and for a while neither of us said anything. Then he said, "I keep thinking she walked these floors pregnant with me, and I've walked them my whole career, and we never once crossed until you." He wasn't sad when he said it. He was something quieter than sad. He was a man standing at the exact center of his own life for the first time. I asked him if he was sure about tonight. If he wanted me to head Sloan off at the door, keep the family away from him, let him get through the dedication without the weight of it. He shook his head. "No," he said. "I've spent 40 years being the thing that got decided about while I wasn't in the room. Somebody decided I could be given away, and I wasn't in the room. Every foster placement, every file decided about me, without me." He looked at the door the guests would come through. "Not tonight. Tonight I'm in the room. If she wants to see me, she can see me. If she can't, I'll know that too, and at least I'll have chosen to stand here and find out." He turned to me. "You gave me that. You understand? For 40 years, I was a sealed file, and you're the one who opened it. Not to use it just so I could finally read my own name. I don't have words for what that is, but I know it's the thing I've wanted my whole life. And my own sister did it with a job her family calls a dead end. I have been called a lot of things by my family. Disappointment, embarrassment, the one who never lived up. My brother, who'd had every reason in the world to trust no one, stood in a saved building and called me the person who came back for him. I carried that into the evening like a stone in my chest, the good kind, the kind that steadies you. Whatever my family did tonight, I already had the only verdict that mattered, and it had come from the one person in that building who knew what it cost to be thrown away. Then the cars started arriving, and my family came in, and I watched them try and fail to keep the contempt on their faces. My father walked in expecting birdhouses, and he stopped in the doorway of that ballroom, and I saw him forget for a second to be my father. My sister came in filming herself, narrating for her followers, so we're at my sister's little event. And then the light hit the room, and even Sloan went quiet just for a moment, before she remembered the story she'd come to prove. And my mother came in last, in her good dress and her good earrings, and she did not look at the ceiling I'd saved or the stair I'd rebuilt. My mother looked at the walls the way you look at the walls of a place that has been waiting for you, and her face was already wrong, already pale, and she reached out once and steadied herself on the back of a chair, and I understood she knew exactly where she was standing. Sloan found me within 10 minutes. She'd been looking for Julian, obviously, scanning the room for the rich older man she was going to catch me with, and when she couldn't immediately connect us, she came to me instead, all bright teeth, and said, loud enough for the people near us, "So where's this famous boss? I'm dying to meet him. I've heard so much." She put a little weight on so much. My father drifted over. My mother stayed by her chair, gray, silent, watching the crowd like a woman watching weather come in. And then Julian came across the room to us. He did exactly what he'd said he'd do. He came to greet my family, warmly, as my boss, the host of the evening, a man thanking the family of the woman who'd saved his building. He was smiling. He hadn't said a word yet. He was still 3 steps away, one hand already lifting to shake my father's hand. My mother made a sound I had never heard a person make. It wasn't a scream. It was smaller and worse than a scream. It was the sound of the air going out of someone. She had turned toward Julian when he approached, out of politeness, the reflex of a careful woman, and she had seen his face, and every drop of color left her all at once. So fast I saw it happen, so fast that my father turned to catch her arm. She went white before Julian said a single word, because she didn't need his name and she didn't need a document. She'd carried that face in a torn photograph for 40 years, and now it was 40 years old and walking toward her in the building where she'd left it, and she knew her son on sight. For one long second, nobody understood what was happening except 3 people, my mother, Julian, and me. And then my sister, who understood nothing, decided this was her moment. Sloane looked at our mother's white face, and she looked at Julian, and she plugged it straight into the only story she had. In her mind, our mother had just witnessed the shameful thing Sloane had been promising everyone: the affair, the fraud, the proof. She thought Mom had gone pale from secondhand embarrassment, and Sloane had an audience, a real one, 200 people and a phone in her hand, and she had staked her whole standing in the family on being right about me, and she was not going to let the moment pass. She stepped back so her voice would carry, and she said, brightly, cruelly, in the ballroom I had saved, "Oh my God, it's true, isn't it? Everyone, this is the boss. This is how my sister got her big fancy project." She actually gestured between me and Julian with her wine glass. I didn't want to believe it, but look at Mom's face. Some of us earned our success the honest way. She smiled at the crowd, inviting them in. I just think people should know what they're really celebrating. The room went quiet in that terrible way rooms go quiet. I looked at my sister, who had just in front of 200 people and a live camera called me a whore to make herself feel tall. I looked at my father, who was nodding along, actually nodding, because it fit. I looked at my mother, who was too destroyed by what she was seeing to even register what her other daughter had just done. And I looked at Julian, my brother, who had come to this room prepared to be gentle with the woman who abandoned him, and who was now watching a family try to grind his sister into the floor on their way past. I had a choice to make, right there. I could have let the sealed thing stay sealed to protect my mother, or I could tell the truth. And I want to be honest about the exact nature of the choice, because this is the whole story. The truth I was holding would demolish my sister's lie completely, but it would also, unavoidably, open the door my mother had spent 40 years bricking shut, in a room full of people, at the worst possible moment. I chose the truth, but I chose to tell it my way, the only way I know how to tell anything. Not with a scream, not with a confession dragged out of anyone. I told it the way I'd tell you why a building deserves to stand, on the evidence, calmly, in order. In a way no one in that room could argue with, because it wasn't my feeling. It was the record. "You're right that people should know what they're celebrating," I said. My voice was steady. I was surprised by how steady. "So let me tell them. 4 years ago," I said to the room, in the level voice I use when I'm explaining why a building is worth saving, "this firm hired me off my portfolio. Not off a dinner, not off a favor. Off drawings, off buildings I'd already brought back, off a record anyone here can look up. 2 years ago, I was assigned the historic documentation for this project because I was the best person on staff to do it, which is also a matter of record. There's a federal application with my name on it as the architectural historian, reviewed and approved by the state, and you cannot flirt your way through a tax credit review, I promise you. My boss had no part in my hiring and nothing to do with my being chosen for this. I earned every inch of this room." Sloane started to say something. "That's convenient." But I kept going because I'd learned a long time ago that the truth doesn't need to raise its voice. But you asked how I got this project, and there is one more true thing, and I only know it because I'm good at the job this family has spent my whole life laughing at. My job is to find the history a building is hiding. So let me tell you the history this building was hiding. I looked at Julian. He gave me the smallest nod, his choice, his door. "This was the Halloran County home," I said. "For most of the last century, it was where this county sent young, unmarried women who were pregnant to have their babies out of sight and give them up. In the spring of 1985, a 17-year-old girl from this town was sent here. I found her name in the admission register. I held the page in my own hands in the state archive, in white gloves, doing my dead-end job. Early the next year, she gave birth in this building to a son, and she gave him up, and she left this town and never spoke its name again. The room was so quiet I could hear the old windows ticking as they cooled. That girl's name in the register was Lorna Ashby. I let it sit. That is my mother's name, before she married my father. It is the name on my mother's baptism certificate in the good drawer at home. I heard my father say very quietly, Lorna, and I heard all those buried years in it. And the son she gave up, I said, was born in this building in 1986, went into this county's foster system, and grew up with nobody, and built a life anyway, and became one of the best in the country at saving the kind of places the world throws away. He bought this building, he told me once, because no one ever came back for it. His name is Julian Cole, his original birth certificate, which the state kept sealed from him his whole life, until he was finally allowed to send for it this year. Name's his birth mother. It says Lorna Ashby. I turned to my sister and I did not raise my voice, and that was the cruelest thing I could have done to her. So no, Sloan, Julian Cole is not my lover. Julian Cole is my brother. I didn't get this project through a man. I found my own brother by being very, very good at the job you toasted on Thanksgiving. That is what everyone is really celebrating tonight. A building that came back, and a family it gave back. I have replayed the next few seconds many times. My sister's face, live on her own camera in front of the people she'd told the lie to, as the lie died. She had staked everything on being right about me, publicly, permanently, and the truth had not argued with her. It had simply set the documents down on the table, my mother's own maiden name in two places 40 years apart, and let her watch them agree. She had nothing to say. For the first time in her life, Sloan had nothing to say. My father had gone gray and still, a man realizing at the same instant that he'd been wrong about his daughter, and wrong about his wife, and wrong, maybe, about the whole shape of his life. Nobody defended anybody. The story they'd all agreed on for 32 years just wasn't there anymore, and there was nothing underneath it, and my mother stood in the middle of it, white, silent, unable to refute a single word because you cannot argue with your own signature. She did not confess. She didn't have to, and I want you to notice that because it matters to me. Nobody wrung a tearful admission out of her under a chandelier. The record spoke. Her name spoke. The building she'd hidden it in gave it up, the way old buildings do. She just stood there and let the truth be true, which was the first honest thing I'd seen her do in my life. Before I tell you what happened between the three of us, I want to say something to you directly, wherever you're listening from. If you've made it this far, you already know this story isn't really about a party. It's about a weight. It's about a woman who carried someone else's fear for 32 years, believing it was her own flaw. So before we finish, I want you to do one thing for yourself. In the quiet after this, ask whether there's a weight you've been carrying that was never yours. A smallness someone handed you and called your name. Leave it in the comments if you want, or just leave it in your own chest where you can finally see it. Because the reason I'm telling you all of this is not the revenge. It's the part after, where I finally set the thing down. Stay with me for that. I didn't finish it in the ballroom. That was the one decision I'm proudest of. I could have let my mother be torn apart in public. She'd handed me enough grief that some part of me wanted to. But Julian had come here to be a person, not a weapon, and I was not going to turn my brother's first meeting with his mother into a spectacle for 200 strangers and my sister's followers. So I asked the guests, gently, to enjoy the evening, and I took my mother and Julian and my silent father into the old library off the ballroom, a room I'd restored, oak shelves and good light, and I shut the door on the crowd. For a moment nobody spoke. My mother looked at Julian the way you'd look at the ocean, like it was too big to take in at the edges. And then, she did the thing I will never forget. She didn't defend herself. She didn't perform. She looked at her son. 40 years old, the image of the boy in the torn photograph. And she said, in a voice with nothing left in it, "I was 17. My father drove me here in the dark. They didn't let me hold you. I've been walking around the outside of this building in my mind for 40 years, and I never once had the courage to come back for you." And then, to Julian, not to me, not to anyone else, "I'm not going to ask you to forgive me. I don't think there's a version of this where I get to ask you for anything." Julian let her finish. He was quiet for a long time, the way he is. And then he said the thing that told me everything about the man my brother had made himself into. Alone. He said, "I didn't come here for an apology. I came here because I wanted to see your face once, on purpose, in the daylight, instead of imagining it. I've got that now." He looked at her steady. "I'm not going to hate you. I decided that a long time ago, for me, not for you. But I'm not going to pretend either. If there's going to be anything between us, it's going to be slow and it's going to be honest, and it's going to be on my terms, because I gave up the right to be given things the day somebody decided I could be given away." He picked up his birth certificate from the table where I'd set it next to the register. "You can have a son. You don't get to have him the easy way. Nobody gets that." That was it. No screaming, no collapse. Just a man setting the terms of his own life, which was the one thing that had always been taken from him. And my mother nodded and wept without sound, and for the first time I felt something for her that wasn't the old ache, not forgiveness. I wasn't there yet, and honestly, some of it I've never gotten to. But I understood her. I finally understood the closed face and the spotless house and the terror of the daughter who dug up the past. And understanding is its own kind of putting down. My father stood by the door the whole time and said almost nothing. There was nothing for him to say. His certainty was gone. He'd built his whole self on knowing what things were worth, and he'd been wrong about the two people at the center of his life. And I watched him understand that the daughter he'd let his wife and his other daughter grind down for 3 decades was the only one in the room who'd told the truth. There was still a dedication to give. That's the strange thing about real life. The ceiling I'd saved didn't care about my family, and 200 people were still standing in the ballroom waiting to celebrate a building coming home. So I wiped my face, and I walked back out, and I did my job. I gave the remarks. I told the town what the Halloran home had been and what it had cost the people who passed through it, and what it would be now, and I watched faces in that crowd go still with their own buried histories, because a place like that touches half a county before it's done. The old woman from the county meeting was there, the one whose sister had been sent to the home. She found me again afterward, and this time she just held both my hands and didn't say anything at all, and she didn't have to. And Julian stood at the back the whole time, in his tuxedo, in the building his mother had lost him in. No longer a sealed file, no longer a thing decided about while he wasn't in the room. He was in the room he'd chosen to be. He caught my eye once across all those people and gave me a single small nod, the same nod he'd given me an hour before, and I understood it meant the same thing it always would between us now. I'm still here. You came back for me. We're not going anywhere. My sister and my father slipped out before the end. My mother stayed until the lights came up, alone at the edge of the room, looking at the sun she couldn't have the easy way. Nobody made her leave. Nobody made her stay. For the first time in her life, as far as I could tell, my mother simply stood in the truth and let it be true, in the very room she'd spent 40 years running from. Let me tell you how it settled, because the reveal is never the end. The end is who you decide to be in the quiet after. My sister did what people like my sister do. She was the one holding the camera, so her own accusation and its collapse went out live to everyone she'd spent weeks poisoning, and there was no editing that. She'd told thousands of people I was a fraud who slept her way up, and those same thousands watched in real time the truth turn out to be that I'd found my own lost brother by being excellent at my work. She took the video down within the hour. It didn't matter. People had seen. And Sloan, who had never once in her life been wrong out loud, could not survive being wrong out loud, so she rewrote it. Within a week, she was the victim. The family had humiliated her, ambushed her, made her big night about them. She never apologized to me. She has still never apologized to me. That's the thing they don't tell you about the reveal. The people who built the lie about you don't always repent when it falls. Some of them just start building a new lie about how you did them wrong by being right. So I set a boundary, and I want to tell you exactly what it was, because boundaries are the whole point and people always leave them vague. I told Sloane I was done being the story she told to feel tall. I said I wished her well, and I meant it. And I said I would not be spending my time or my peace on someone who called me a whore in public and a victim in private, and then I stopped answering the messages that were designed to pull me back into the fight, not out of hatred, out of arithmetic. I had spent 32 years paying for her comfort with my own smallness, and I had finally seen the bill, and I stopped paying it. My father is a harder story. He didn't defend me at that table, not once, in 3 decades. He laughed hardest on Thanksgiving, at the daughter who turned out to be the only honest one in the room. I don't get to skip past that, but I watched a certain man lose all his certainty in one night, and in the months after he started, clumsily to try. He asked me about the building. He actually drove up to see it alone and stood in the ballroom a long time, and when he came out, his eyes were red, and he didn't explain, and I didn't ask. We are not healed. We may not get all the way there. But he calls now, and he listens more than he talks, which he never used to do, and I've decided that a man genuinely trying at 63 is worth a slow door, if not a wide open one. My mother and Julian, I can't tie in a bow, and I won't. They talk, slowly, on his terms, exactly as he said. He has not called her mom, and I don't know if he ever will, and that's his to decide and no one else's. She sent him, a few weeks after the gala, the other half of the photograph. No, not the half she'd torn away and destroyed. She'd lied about that too, or maybe lied to herself. She'd kept it. 40 years she'd told herself she'd destroyed the boy's face, and the truth was she'd never been able to, and it was in the bottom of that same shoebox the whole time. A young stonemason, 21 years old, laughing against a wall he'd built, with his arm around a girl who would spend the rest of her life pretending he never existed. She gave the only picture of his father that exists in the world to the son she gave away. It's the closest thing to an apology I think she has in her. It may have to be enough. It's not mine to grade. And me, I got a brother. That's the part I still can't quite believe on ordinary days. I spent my whole life as the extra daughter, the disappointment, the one the family measured the good one against. And it turns out I had a brother the entire time, a good and quiet and honest man, and I found him with the exact skill they taught me to be ashamed of. We work together still. We had dinner last Sunday. He's slow to trust, the way you'd expect from a man who was given away and raised by no one, but he trusts me. And there's a particular weight to being trusted by someone who doesn't do it easily. He told me once that for 40 years he'd bought and saved old buildings because no one ever came back for them, and that he understood now that he'd been trying, the whole time, to be the person who came back, and that I was the one who finally came back for him. I've built a lot of things in my life. I've never been prouder of anything than I am of that sentence. The Halloran home is open now. Children take art classes in the room where children were once given away. The town that voted 3 times to demolish it holds its weddings there. The low stone wall at the back of the property still stands because a 22-year-old who died on a scaffold in 1987 built it well enough to outlast the roof, outlast the institution, outlast the woman who leaned against it and the secret she kept. Long enough for his own daughter-in-law of history, his son's found sister, to run her hand along it and finally know his name. Good work lasts. That's not a metaphor. It's just true. It's why I do the job. So here's what I want to leave you with. Wherever you are, whatever weight you walked in here carrying, For 32 years, I believed I was a disappointment because the people who were supposed to love me handed me their own fear and told me it was my name. And the thing that saved me wasn't a confrontation, and it wasn't revenge, and it wasn't even the truth about my mother. It was the moment I understood that the smallness I'd been carrying had never been mine. Someone had just been storing it in me because they couldn't hold it themselves. You might be carrying one too, a weight with someone else's name on it, a story about how you're the failure, the difficult one, the disappointment that you never actually wrote, that was handed to you, wrapped up as a flaw by someone who needed somewhere to put their own fear. You are allowed to read the label, you are allowed to see whose handwriting it's in, and you are allowed finally to set it down. They called it a dead-end job. It dug up the truth, and it gave me a brother, and it handed me back my own life. Nothing about it was a dead end. It turns out I was never restoring the buildings. I was learning how to come back for the things everyone else gave up on, starting with myself.